My name is Flora Bishop, and at 72 years of age, I find myself in a world transformed, a world I helped to shape in ways no one, least of all me, could have ever predicted. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages on the cobblestones of my youth has been replaced by the distant, rhythmic chuffing of the very locomotives that built my fortune, and the soft gaslight of the drawing rooms where I was once invisible has given way to the steady, clean glow of electric lamps. My life has been long, and for the most part quiet, but it was defined by one spectacular moment, a cataclysmic reversal of fortune that echoed through the highest echelons of society. I never imagined that the pennies I scraped together in the shadows of my cousin's glittering life, the coins I saved by forgoing a ribbon for my bonnet or a lump of sugar for my tea, would one day become the very foundation that would save her from utter ruin. This isn't a story of revenge, not really. It is far more complex than that. It's the story of how being invisible, of being the quiet, overlooked girl in the corner, became my greatest and most enduring strength. It is the story of how the world turned upside down. Before I dive into how a single secret ledger book changed the course of two families and an entire financial empire, I want to welcome you. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always a comfort to know how far a story can travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever had your potential dismissed by those who were supposed to see it most clearly, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for all the newcomers here, I invite you to subscribe, to join this community where we understand that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. What would you do if the world you knew vanished in a single day? Let's explore that. My life began not with a bang, but with a whisper. I was a bishop, a name with a respectable but faded lineage, a distant branch on the magnificent family tree of the Beaumonts. After my parents were taken by a fever when I was just 10, I was brought to live at Beaumont Hall, the sprawling country estate of my mother's cousin, Lord Beaumont. I was what the novels of the day called a poor relation, a title I wore as visibly as the plain gray dresses that were my uniform. Beaumont Hall was a world of breathtaking opulence, a universe unto itself. Sunlight streamed through cathedral-sized windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over priceless Persian rugs. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of dozens of servants and smelled perpetually of beeswax, lemon oil, and the hothouse lilies that Lady Beaumont insisted be placed in every room. And at the center of this universe was its son, my cousin, Seraphina Beaumont. She was 2 years my senior, and she was everything I was not. Where my hair was a simple, unassuming brown, hers was a cascade of spun gold. Where my eyes were a quiet gray, hers were the vibrant blue of a summer sky. Where I was silent and observant, she was a symphony of laughter, charm, and effortless grace. She moved through life as if it were a ballroom designed for her exclusive pleasure, and in a way it was. Her days were a whirlwind of fittings with Parisian dressmakers, riding lessons on thoroughbred horses, and planning for the endless succession of galas, soirees, and weekend parties that constituted the life of a debutante of her standing. My own existence was a pale reflection, a life lived in the margins. My duties were nebulously defined but ever present. I was to be a companion to Seraphina. This meant I was the silent partner in her waltzing practice, the patient model for her amateur watercolor painting, the fetcher of forgotten fans and misplaced sheet music. When her friends, a flock of brightly colored chattering birds, descended upon the house, I was the one to pour the tea, to ensure the platter of macarons was never empty, to sit in a straight-back chair just outside the circle of their gossip, present but not participating. I was a piece of the furniture, useful and utterly ignored. Seraphina was not intentionally cruel, not in the way a villain in a melodrama might be. Her cruelty was of a more casual, thoughtless variety, born of a lifetime of never having to consider the feelings of someone she deemed beneath her. It was the easy condescension of the truly privileged. "Oh, Flora, you must borrow my old blue silk for the garden party," she would say, her voice bright with what she believed was generosity. "It's terribly out of fashion now, of course, but it will be leagues better than that dreary gray thing you always wear." She never considered that the dreary gray thing was one of only 2 good dresses I owned. Once I had saved for months to purchase a small, simple silver locket. It was my only treasure. A week after I bought it, I saw it around Seraphina's neck as she headed out for a ride. "Isn't it charming?" she'd trilled when she saw me looking. I found it in a little box on your dresser. You don't mind, do you, darling? It goes perfectly with my riding habit." I didn't have the words, or perhaps the courage, to tell her that it was the only beautiful thing that was truly mine. I simply nodded, a familiar ache settling in my chest. To her, my possessions were simply an extension of the house's general inventory, available for her use. My uncle, Lord Beaumont, was a man carved from the same privileged stone. He was the head of the Beaumont Bank, a centuries-old institution that was considered a pillar of London's financial world. He was tall, imposing, with a voice that boomed with unquestionable authority. He saw me as an act of charity, a testament to his own benevolence. Once a month he would summon me to his cavernous leather-bound study. He would sit behind his massive mahogany desk, a fortress of commerce, and withdraw a small embroidered purse from a drawer. "For your little necessities, Flora," he would say, pushing it across the polished surface. "A little pin money. Do not squander it." The purse contained a tiny stipend, an amount so meager it was almost insulting. It was enough for sewing thread, soap, perhaps a new set of hairpins every few months. To him it was a grand gesture. To me it was a constant reminder of my dependence, of my status as a permanent guest who must earn her keep through gratitude and meekness. In those early years I spent that money exactly as he expected. A bit of lace to trim a collar, a new ribbon for my hair. I tried to make myself a little less plain, a little less gray, hoping perhaps to finally be seen, but it was a futile effort. In a garden of exotic orchids, a simple daisy goes unnoticed. The turning point came during one of Serafina's legendary summer balls. The entire county was in attendance. The ballroom was a sea of glittering jewels, rustling silks, and fragrant perfumes. A string orchestra played Viennese waltzes, and champagne flowed from fountains of ice. Serafina was incandescent, a vision in white satin and diamonds, holding court in the center of the room. My role, as usual, was to be a wallflower, to stand near the terrace doors and assist any ladies who felt faint or needed their shawls retrieved. From my vantage point, I could observe everything. I saw the young dandies fawning over Serafina, but I found myself listening to the men of my uncle's generation. They stood in small, serious clusters, their voices low, discussing matters far from the ballroom floor. They spoke of crop failures in the colonies, of shipping routes, and of the established value of land. But then a younger man, a brash industrialist from the north, began to speak. His voice was full of energy, cutting through the staid conversation. He spoke not of land, but of iron. He spoke of steam engines that could pull 100 tons of coal from Manchester to London in a single day. He spoke of new mechanical looms that could weave more cloth in an hour than a dozen women could in a week. My uncle and his cohort were dismissive. "Vulgar speculation," Lord Beaumont declared with a sniff. "A noisy, dirty business. Beaumont wealth is in the land, as it always has been, and always will be." The other men nodded in agreement, turning their backs on the industrialist. But I had heard something else. I had heard the sound of the future. A thought, small and radical, began to form in my mind. What if my uncle was wrong? What if the world was changing faster than men like him could see? That night, tucked away in my small attic room, the orchestra music a faint pulse through the floorboards, I looked at the few shillings left from my monthly stipend. For the first time, I didn't see a new ribbon. I saw a seed. The next day, I began my secret life. I started by making a conscious decision to become even more invisible. I stopped trying to adorn myself. I walked the 2 miles into the village instead of asking a groom to ready a pony cart. I mended my dresses until the stitches were finer than the original weave. I ate the plainest fare at the servants' table when I could, avoiding the rich, wasteful dinners in the main hall. Every saved penny, every shilling not spent, went into a small locked metal box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my room. It grew with agonizing slowness. Saving the money was only the first step. The true challenge was figuring out what to do with it. A woman, particularly an unmarried one with no fortune of her own, could not simply walk into the London Stock Exchange. I needed an agent, an intermediary, and I knew I could never use the Beaumont Bank. My uncle would see it as a grotesque joke, and my accounts would be scrutinized. My attention turned to a man I had observed on my infrequent trips to the bank with my aunt. His name was Mr. Davis. He was a junior clerk, a man no one ever noticed, which was precisely why I noticed him. He sat at a small, cramped desk in the corner, his head always bent over ledgers, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. But unlike the other clerks, who had a dull, resigned air, Mr. Davis's eyes were sharp and intelligent. I saw him reading newspapers, not the society pages, but the financial columns. I once saw him tuck a pamphlet on steam power into his satchel. He was like me, overlooked but observant. It took me a month to work up the courage to approach him. I waited for him one evening after the bank had closed, finding him on a side street, walking home. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Mr. Davies," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. He turned, startled. He didn't recognize me at first. "I am Flora Bishop, Lord Beaumont's niece." Recognition dawned, followed by confusion. "Miss Bishop, is something amiss?" We stood in the damp London air, the smell of coal smoke and rain around us. I explained, in a low, rushed voice, what I wanted. I didn't tell him everything, of course. I spoke of a small personal project and an interest in the new industries. I expected him to laugh, or worse, to report me to my uncle for my absurd presumption. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, a long silence stretched between us. "You understand," he said finally, his voice cautious, "that this is highly irregular, and the ventures you speak of, they are considered speculative, risky. You could lose everything." "It is not very much to lose," I replied, the truth of that statement hanging in the air. He studied my face for a moment longer. Perhaps he saw in my plain dress and earnest expression a kindred spirit, another soul trapped by the rigid hierarchies of our world. "There is a new firm," he said slowly, "not a grand bank like your uncle's, a small brokerage. They deal in these new securities. I could make an inquiry on behalf of a client who wishes to remain anonymous." My breath caught in my throat. It was a lifeline. "Thank you, Mr. Davies," I whispered. "I am in your debt. Let us see if there is a profit first," he said with the ghost of a smile. "Then we can speak of debts." Our first transaction was terrifying. I met Mr. Davies in a quiet corner of a public lending library, the scent of old paper and dust our only witness. I passed him the contents of my metal box, a small, heavy collection of coins that represented a year of scrimping and saving. He counted it carefully. It was enough to purchase a single share in the Great Western Railway Company. A single share. It felt both momentous and laughably small. A few days later, he met me again and pressed a crisp certificate into my hand. My name was on it, Miss Flora Bishop. I had never seen my name on anything so important. I felt a thrill that was sharper and more satisfying than any new gown or invitation to a ball could ever be. I smuggled the certificate back to Beaumont Hall and hid it in the false bottom of an old sewing box, my secret treasure. That same week, Seraphina returned from a shopping trip to London. Her rooms were filled with boxes from Bond Street. She modeled a new ball gown for her mother and me, a confection of ivory silk and seed pearls that had cost more than the yearly salary of a dozen men like Mr. Davies. "Isn't it divine?" she spun, the pearls shimmering in the candlelight. "It's for the Duchess's midsummer gala. One must make an impression." I looked at her, so beautiful, so confident, so utterly oblivious, and then I thought of my single folded piece of paper hidden in a sewing box. She was making an impression. I was making an investment. The difference felt profound. A few months later, a letter arrived for me, care of a general delivery address Mr. Davies had established. It was a note from the brokerage firm. The Great Western Railway had declared its first dividend. My single share had earned me the princely sum of 5 shillings. It was nothing. It was everything. It was proof. Proof that the industrialist at the party was right. Proof that my uncle was wrong. Proof that my own judgment had value. That evening, I purchased a simple, sturdy ledger and a new pot of ink. On the first page, in my neatest script, I wrote, "Assets of Miss Flora Bishop." Below it, I made my first entry, 1 share, Great Western Railway, and below that, dividend received 5 shillings. The book was almost empty, but holding it, I felt a sense of ownership, of agency, that I had never known. The world outside my attic window was changing, and now, in my own small, secret way, I was changing with it. While Seraphina danced, I did my sums. While she collected suitors, I collected shares. Our worlds, lived under the same roof, could not have been further apart. The years that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, a strange dual existence. To the Beaumonts and their glittering social circle, I remained exactly as I had always been, plain, quiet Flora, the poor relation, a permanent fixture of the household, as unremarkable as a grandfather clock in the hall. My days were still structured around Seraphina's whims. I helped her choose between silks for a new morning dress. I read poetry aloud to her on rainy afternoons. I sat silently in the carriage as she paid her social calls. I was a shadow in her sunlit life, and my acquiescence was so complete that they never thought to look for any substance beneath it. They saw what they expected to see, a grateful, simple girl, content with her lot. But in the quiet hours of the night, in the solitary sanctuary of my room, a different Flora emerged. I became a student of a world my uncle and his kind willfully ignored. Mr. Davies became more than an agent. He was my tutor, my collaborator. He would smuggle me copies of The Economist and financial prospectuses, documents that were considered utterly unsuitable for a lady's eyes. I would hide them under my mattress, and by the light of a single candle I would devour them. I learned the language of this new world: capital, dividends, liabilities, stock. I learned the names of the men who were building it, the engineers, the inventors, the iron magnates. They were not lords or dukes, but their power felt more real, more tangible, forged in fire and steam, not inherited through a dusty lineage. My portfolio, recorded in the ever-filling pages of my ledger, grew steadily. After the railway, I bought into a company that manufactured steam-powered looms in Manchester. My dividend of 5 shillings was joined by others. The meager sums began to compound. I reinvested every penny. I learned to be patient, to ignore the dramatic short-term fluctuations of the market that would have panicked a seasoned investor, let alone a novice. My isolation became my advantage. I was insulated from the feverish, panicked gossip of the men's clubs and the stock exchange floor. My decisions were based on my own research and the cold, hard logic of the numbers in my ledger. I diversified, following the arteries of this new industrial age. From railways and textiles, I branched into coal mines that fueled the engines and the shipping lines that transported the goods across the globe. My relationship with Mr. Davis also evolved. Our clandestine meetings moved from library corners to the quiet back room of a respectable tea shop. He no longer treated me with the cautious deference of a clerk speaking to a nobleman's niece. He spoke to me as an equal, a fellow strategist. "Miss Bishop," he'd say, spreading a map of proposed railway lines across the table, "the prospectus for the London to York line is promising, but I have concerns about their mineral rights claims in the Midlands. I think the Northumbrian line offers a more secure, if less spectacular, return." We would debate the merits, our heads bent close together, two shadows conspiring to build a fortune. He had been investing alongside me, his own small savings growing in concert with mine. His fortunes were rising, too. He was no longer a junior clerk. The small brokerage firm he had introduced me to had grown, and he was now a junior partner, his name on the letterhead. His respect for me was the only validation I received, and it was more meaningful than any compliment Seraphina could have ever bestowed. Meanwhile, Seraphina's life was accelerating toward its own grand climax. She had become the undisputed jewel of London society, her beauty and charm the subject of endless newspaper columns. Suitors swarmed around her, but her father had his sights set on the highest prize, a duke, and he found one. The Duke of Allister was old, with a lineage that stretched back to the Norman conquest, and possessed a sprawling, crumbling ancestral castle in Scotland. He also possessed a mountain of debt. It was a classic arrangement, Beaumont money for an ancient title. Seraphina was ecstatic. She cared little for the man himself, who was twice her age and dull as ditch water, but she was enthralled with the idea of becoming a duchess. The preparations for the wedding were staggering, an exercise in excess that made all previous Beaumont extravagances pale in comparison. A trousseau of 50 gowns was commissioned from Paris. The Beaumont townhome in London was redecorated from top to bottom. A guest list of 500 of Europe's most elite was drawn up. My uncle, Lord Beaumont, spared no expense. He was buying his daughter the highest rank in the land, and he wanted the world to witness his largesse. He saw it as the ultimate solidification of his family's power, the crowning achievement of the Beaumont dynasty. It was during this period of frantic, joyful preparation that the first tremors were felt, the first subtle cracks in the gilded facade of the Beaumont empire. The Beaumont Bank, for all its prestige, was an institution of the past. Its wealth was tied to vast agricultural estates, colonial plantations, and government bonds, investments that were stable, respectable, and increasingly stagnant. I saw it in the financial papers Mr. Davies provided. While the dividends from my industrial stocks were climbing, the value of the commodities my uncle traded in was slowly declining. A drought in the West Indies crippled the sugar harvest on one of his largest plantations. A border skirmish in India disrupted the tea trade. Each was a small blow in itself, but they began to accumulate. I felt a growing sense of dread, a cold knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with my own finances and everything to do with the family I lived with. For all their dismissal of me, they were the only family I had. I felt a strange, complicated sense of loyalty. I decided I had to try to warn them. My first attempt was with Serafina. I found her in her sitting room, surrounded by swatches of silk and lace, debating the color scheme for the wedding breakfast. "Serafina," I began tentatively, "with all these expenses for the wedding, are you certain the bank is secure?" She looked up from a bolt of damask, her brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. "The bank? What an absurd question, Flora." "It's just," I pressed on, my voice faltering under her impatient gaze, "I read an article about the instability of colonial agriculture. Perhaps it would be prudent to be more conservative." She let out a tinkling laugh, a sound that was suddenly as sharp and cold as breaking glass. "Oh, Flora, you are such a goose," she said, turning to her mother, who had just entered the room. "Flora is worried about our finances. Can you imagine?" Lady Beaumont smiled a thin, condescending smile. "Flora, dear, your concern is sweet, but you must understand, the Beaumont Bank is not some grubby little shop. It is an institution. It is as solid as England itself. You mustn't trouble your little head with matters that don't concern you." The dismissal was absolute. I was the poor relation, the simpleton, and my concerns were the foolish ramblings of an ignorant child. I retreated, the rebuke stinging like a slap. A few months later, a rival bank, a smaller but still significant institution, suddenly collapsed. The news sent a shiver through the city. That evening, Lord Beaumont was quiet at the dinner table, his face drawn and gray. It was the first time I had ever seen him look worried. He grumbled about reckless management and new money charlatans, but the bravado in his voice sounded hollow. Lady Beaumont, ever the master of denial, was more concerned that the bank's failure would mean the wife of its chairman would now be unable to attend Serafina's wedding. Serafina herself didn't even seem to register the news, chattering on about her honeymoon plans for a grand tour of Italy and Greece. It was as if they were all living in a play, and as long as they recited their lines correctly, the scenery could not possibly collapse around them. I knew I had to try one last time. This time I went directly to the source. I requested a meeting with my uncle in his study. He seemed amused by my formal request. "Well, Flora, this is all very mysterious. What can I do for you?" He gestured for me to sit, but remained standing himself, a subtle assertion of his dominance. I had rehearsed my words carefully. I didn't mention my own knowledge. I framed it as things I had overheard from tradesmen in the village, as idle gossip I was concerned about. "Uncle," I said, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking, "I hear talk that the future is not in land, but in steam and steel. I worry about the bank's deep investments in the Caribbean plantations. With the abolitionist movements growing stronger and the soil becoming depleted." He cut me off with a patronizing chuckle. He walked over and patted me on the head, as if I were a small child who had just recited a nursery rhyme. "My dear girl," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you have a good heart, a wonderfully loyal heart, but you must not trouble your pretty head with such complicated matters. The world of high finance is no place for a woman's sentiment. Leave business to the men who understand it. Now run along. I believe your aunt needs help with the seating chart for the wedding dinner. That is something you can be truly helpful with." I walked out of that study and felt something inside me shift, a final quiet click of a lock turning. I had tried. I had offered them the truth as I saw it, and they had not just rejected it, they had mocked it. They had patted my head and sent me back to the women's world of seating charts and flower arrangements. My sense of duty had been fulfilled and discarded. From now on, my only duty was to my own future, the future I was building in secret, one share at a time. I went to my room, took out my ledger, and looked at the final column. The numbers were no longer just promising, they were substantial. I was no longer a girl with a hobby. I was a wealthy woman. No one in the world knew it except for me and Mr. Davies, and as the date of Seraphina's wedding loomed, a day the Beaumonts saw as their ultimate triumph, I felt a cold certainty that it would instead be the day of their reckoning. The morning of Seraphina's wedding dawned crisp and clear, a perfect autumn day. The house had been in a state of controlled chaos for a week, but now a hushed, reverent excitement had settled over it. Downstairs, florists were putting the final touches on colossal arrangements of lilies and roses. In the kitchen, the chefs were preparing a breakfast for 500 guests. Upstairs, in her sun-drenched suite of rooms, Seraphina was being laced into her wedding gown, a magnificent creation of Brussels lace and satin that had taken a small army of seamstresses 6 months to complete. She was surrounded by her mother, her bridesmaids, and a flock of maids, all fluttering around her like moths to a flame. I stood near the door, holding her veil, my designated role for the morning. She was radiant, a storybook princess on the verge of her happily ever after. The first sign that something was wrong came not as a thunderclap, but as a discreet knock on the bedroom door. A footman entered, his face pale, and whispered something in Lady Beaumont's ear. She waved him away with an irritated gesture. "Not now, Jennings. Whatever it is can wait." A few minutes later, another, more urgent knock. This time it was the head butler, Mr. Hemlock, a man whose composure was legendary. He did not whisper. He spoke in a low, tight voice that cut through the cheerful chatter. "My lady, you must come. Lord Beaumont requires you in his study immediately." The tone, more than the words, sent a chill through the room. Lady Beaumont, her face a mask of annoyance, swept out. A strange silence fell. Seraphina, still admiring herself in the full-length mirror, seemed not to notice. "Flora, my veil," she commanded, holding out her hands, as I stepped forward to place the cascade of silk tulle over her perfectly coiffed hair. We heard it, a sound that did not belong in the refined halls of Beaumont Hall. A scream. It was a raw, ragged sound of pure despair, and it came from the direction of the study. Lady Beaumont. Seraphina froze, her hands dropping to her sides. What on earth was that? The bridesmaids looked at each other, their eyes wide with alarm. The chaos that followed was swift and total. Doors slammed. Raised voices echoed from the grand staircase. Mr. Hemlock appeared again, his face ashen. "Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice cracking, "the wedding is to be postponed." Seraphina stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue. "Postponed? What are you talking about? 500 guests are arriving in 2 hours." Before he could answer, a frantic maid rushed in. "It's the bank, miss. The bank has failed." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible. Failed? Banks didn't fail. Not the Beaumont Bank. It was then that the Duke of Allister and his family were announced. They were not dressed for a wedding. They were dressed in severe, dark traveling clothes, their faces grim. They were accompanied by two sharp-faced men who could only be lawyers. They bypassed the drawing rooms and marched directly to the study. The door closed behind them with a dreadful finality. Seraphina, her face now sheet white beneath her makeup, began to tremble. She looked at me, her eyes wild with confusion and fear. "Flora, what is happening?" For the first time in her life, she was asking me for information, for an answer. I had none to give, only a cold, sickening sense of inevitability. The study door opened an hour later. Lord Beaumont emerged, but it was not the same man who had entered. The proud, booming patriarch was gone. In his place was a stooped, shrunken old man, his face a mess of gray stubble and broken blood vessels. He looked right through us, his eyes utterly vacant, and staggered toward a chair. Lady Beaumont followed, weeping hysterically. Then came the Duke. He paused in the doorway, his gaze falling on Seraphina, who stood like a statue in the middle of her room, a grotesque parody of a bride. He did not approach her. He spoke from a distance, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "My apologies, Miss Beaumont," he said, the formal address a brutal confirmation of their new reality. "The circumstances have altered. My family's solicitors have advised that the marriage contract is now null and void." He bowed, a curt, dismissive gesture, and turned to leave. Seraphine finally broke. "Allister," she cried, taking a step toward him, "you can't. We are to be married." He didn't even turn around. "The Beaumont name is now synonymous with ruin and disgrace," he said over his shoulder. "We cannot afford to be associated with it." And then he was gone, his footsteps and those of his family receding down the grand staircase, a final, definitive sound. Seraphina let out a choked sob. She looked around the room, at the maids, the bridesmaids who were now backing away, averting their eyes as if her ruin were contagious. She looked at her reflection, the beautiful bride in the priceless gown. And then her eyes, wild and full of a dawning, uncomprehending agony, landed on me. Her grief, too vast and terrifying to be directed at its real sources, her father, the Duke, the faceless forces of the market, needed a target. It needed a vessel, and I was there. Safe, familiar, the eternal scapegoat. You, she hissed, her voice venomous. She advanced on me, her silken train whispering across the carpet. This is somehow your fault. I've seen you. Always lurking, always watching from the corners with your pinched, jealous little face. You wished for this, didn't you? You prayed for my downfall because you could never have a life like mine. She began to tear at her veil, ripping the delicate lace from her hair. You miserable, pathetic little mouse. You wanted to see me ruined. She raised her hand as if to strike me, and in that moment, something inside me, a dam of patience that had been building for 17 years, finally broke. But it did not break in a torrent of anger. It broke in a wave of absolute chilling calm. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood my ground and met her enraged, tear-filled eyes. I let her storm. I let her scream and sob and beat her fists against a gilded dressing table, her accusations growing more hysterical and unhinged. I let her exhaust the first great wave of her agony, and when she was finally spent, when she had collapsed into a chair, a heap of ruined satin and shattered dreams, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried across the devastated room with perfect clarity. No, Serafina, I did not wish for this. In fact, I tried to warn you. I tried to warn you all. From the hallway, my uncle, who had heard the commotion, looked in. His face already a mask of defeat, twisted in confusion. Warn us, he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. A slip of a girl like you? What could you possibly know about anything? The condescension was still there, a ghost of his former authority, reflexive and pathetic. It was the last time he would ever speak to me that way. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them all in their stunned silence. I went to my own small, plain room, the one place in this house that was mine. I unlocked my trunk, lifted the false bottom of my sewing box, and retrieved my ledger. It felt heavy and solid in my hand, a book of undeniable facts in a house drowning in illusion. I walked back to Serafina's suite. They were all still there, frozen in their tableau of despair. I walked to a delicate marble-topped table, swept aside a silver-backed hairbrush and a crystal perfume bottle, and placed the ledger down. I opened it. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Serafina's ragged breaths. "While you were in Paris ordering gowns, Serafina," I said, my voice still level, "I was buying shares in the Manchester and Liverpool Railway." I turned a page. The neat columns of my handwriting were a stark contrast to the chaos around us. "While you were planning balls, I was investing in the new steam-powered looms that are making fabrics like this dress obsolete. While you were choosing a duke, I was placing my faith in coal and iron and the transatlantic steamship lines." I looked at my uncle, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "I tried to tell you, uncle. I tried to tell you that the world had changed, that your fortune, built on sugar and land, was built on sand. You patted me on the head and told me to go arrange the seating chart. I ran my finger down the final column, the culmination of years of secret work, of sacrifice, of being underestimated. The final sum was written at the bottom. It was a staggering figure, a fortune that likely dwarfed what the Beaumont Bank had held in its final desperate days. "The Beaumont Bank is gone," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "Your title is gone. Your gowns and your jewels will be seized by the creditors. All of this," I gestured around the opulent room, "is an illusion that has just evaporated." I closed the ledger with a soft, definitive thud. I looked at Serafina, at her tear-streaked face, at the dawning, horrified comprehension in her eyes. For the first time she was truly seeing me. Not as the mousy cousin, not as the poor relation, but as a stranger who held all the power. "This," I tapped the cover of the book, "is real. And now you have a choice. You can cling to your pride in the gutter, or you can accept my help." The days that followed the collapse were a blur of humiliating practicalities. The magnificent Beaumont estate, with its priceless art and sprawling gardens, was no longer a home. It was an asset to be liquidated. Bailiffs, grim-faced men with clipboards, swarmed the house. their muddy boots scarring the polished floors as they tagged every chair, every painting, every silver spoon. The army of servants was dismissed, their wages paid from a small fund I advanced. They left one by one, some with tears in their eyes, others with a look of grim satisfaction. The silence they left behind was vast and unnerving. I took charge. There was no one else to do it. Lord Beaumont was a ghost, a broken man who spent his days staring into a dead fireplace, muttering about betrayal and bad luck. Lady Beaumont had taken to her bed, succumbing to a nervous condition that required constant smelling salts and absolute quiet. And Seraphina was lost in a fog of disbelief and rage. My first act was to hire my own solicitor and accountants, using Mr. Davies's firm to manage the transactions. They were brutally efficient. They negotiated with the creditors, managing the bankruptcy in a way that preserved a sliver of the family's personal effects and shielded them from the worst of the public disgrace. I paid their fees from my own accounts, an irony that was not lost on me. We were forced to leave Beaumont Hall and move into a small rented townhouse in a respectable but unfashionable part of London. To the Beaumonts it was a hovel. The three of them, accustomed to 100 rooms, were now crammed into a space with a single drawing room and 4 bedrooms. There was one servant, a stout, no-nonsense cook-housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, whom I hired and paid for. The contrast between their old life and this new one was a daily grinding torture for them. The rich food was gone, replaced by simple stews and baked bread. The carriages were gone, replaced by the necessity of walking or, on rare occasions, hiring a public cab. The deference was gone. The local shopkeepers did not bow and scrape. They simply expected to be paid on time. Seraphina struggled the most. Her entire identity had been wrapped up in her status, her beauty, her wealth. Without them, she was nothing. She drifted through the small dark rooms of the townhouse like a phantom, still wearing the remnants of her fine silk dresses, now limp and slightly soiled. She was incapable of doing anything for herself. She did not know how to light a fire, make a cup of tea, or even brush her own hair properly. Her helplessness was profound. For the first few weeks, she was sullen and petulant, issuing orders to Mrs. Gable as if she were still mistress of a great estate, only to be met with a stony glare. "If you want tea, Miss Seraphina," the housekeeper said one afternoon, "the kettle is on the stove. You've got hands same as me." Her former friends, the flock of glittering socialites, abandoned her completely. They crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations ceased to arrive. She was a pariah, a living embodiment of the social death they all feared. One afternoon, desperate for funds, she took one of her last remaining pieces of jewelry, a diamond brooch, to a Bond Street jeweler. She returned hours later, her face pale and streaked with tears. "He offered me a pittance," she whispered, collapsing into a chair. He looked at me like I was dirt. It was her first real taste of the world as most people experienced it, a world without the protective insulation of a famous name and a bottomless purse. My relationship with her during this time was tense and strange. We lived in close quarters, two people bound by a shared past, but now separated by a chasm of experience and power. I did not rub her nose in her misfortune. I felt no triumph, only a weary sense of responsibility. I tried, gently, to teach her. "Seraphina, this is the household account book," I said one morning, placing it on the table. "We have a budget now. Everything must be recorded." She stared at the book as if it were a poisonous snake. "I am not a shopkeeper," she spat back, her pride a ragged shield. "No," I replied calmly, not looking up from my own papers. "Neither am I. I am an investor, but we all must eat, and this is what eating costs." The house was my base of operations. While the Beaumonts languished in their diminished reality, I was busy. Mr. Davies and I were laying the groundwork for a new venture. We saw a gap in the market. The old banks, like my uncle's, were dinosaurs, too slow and proud to recognize the changing world. They wouldn't lend to the very innovators who were building the future. Our idea was to create a new kind of investment firm, one that would specialize in funding these new industries. It was a bold, ambitious plan, and it consumed my days. The townhouse drawing room became my office, the dining table my desk, covered in maps, prospectuses, and correspondence. The first hint of a thaw between me and Seraphina came unexpectedly. It was late one evening. I was poring over a complex proposal for a new transatlantic shipping line that planned to use screw propellers instead of paddle wheels, a revolutionary concept. I was so engrossed I didn't hear her enter the room. She stood there for a long time, just watching me. I finally looked up, startled. She was looking not at me, but at the papers spread across the table. For the first time, her expression held not anger or resentment, but a flicker of genuine curiosity. "What are you reading?" she asked, her voice quiet. I was so surprised by the simple, direct question that I almost didn't answer. I hesitated, then decided to respond in kind. "It's a prospectus," I said, pointing to a diagram. "For a new type of steamship. The designer believes this propeller will make the crossing to America 2 days faster." I expected her to scoff or walk away, bored. Instead, she came closer and peered at the drawing. "Faster?" she asked. "Why does that matter?" "Faster means more crossings per year," I explained, warming to the subject. "More crossings mean more cargo. More cargo means more profit for the investors." I laid out the simple, powerful logic of it, the engine of commerce that was so alien to her world of inherited wealth. She didn't understand all the technical details, but she understood the conclusion. She listened, her brow furrowed in concentration, for nearly half an hour. When I finished, she simply nodded. "I see," she said, and left the room. It was the first real conversation we had had in our entire lives. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a seed of respect, planted in the barren ground of their ruin. Slowly, painfully, Serafina began to emerge from the wreckage of her old self. The process was not linear. There were days of bitter tears and angry resentment, moments when she would lash out, mourning the life she had lost. But the small flicker of interest I had seen that night began to grow. Humiliation, it turned out, was a powerful teacher. With no other prospects and no one else to turn to, she began to gravitate toward the one center of power and purpose in the house, my work. It started with small things. She began tidying the papers on the dining table, arranging them into neat piles. I didn't ask her to, she just did it. Perhaps it was a faint echo of her old life, of bringing order to her surroundings, or perhaps it was a simple need to be useful. I noticed she had a natural eye for organization. Then one day, as I was drafting a letter to a potential investor, she pointed over my shoulder. "That sentence is clumsy," she said. I bristled, my old defensiveness rising. "It should be more direct. The potential for growth is significant. Not, it is our considered opinion that there exists a significant potential for growth." I looked at the sentence, then back at her. She was right. Her entire life had been an education in social diplomacy, in using language with precision and charm to achieve a desired effect. She knew how to persuade. From that day on, a new, unspoken routine developed. She would sit with me as I worked, at first in silence, just watching and listening. Then she began to read the documents herself. She would ask questions, sharp and insightful ones that often cut to the heart of the matter. While I was focused on the numbers, the balance sheets, the technical specifications, she would focus on the people behind them. "This inventor," she'd say, tapping a prospectus, "his letters sound arrogant. A man this proud might refuse to take advice later. Is he the sort we want to be in business with?" She possessed an intuitive understanding of character, honed by years of navigating the treacherous currents of high society, of discerning a sycophant from a true ally, a braggart from a man of substance. It was a skill I utterly lacked, and I began to realize how valuable it was. Our project was taking shape. Mr. Davies and I had secured our initial capital and were ready to formally launch our firm. We had a name, Bishop and Davies. But as I prepared the final documents, I felt a sense of incompleteness. I looked across the table at Serafina. She was no longer the broken creature who had arrived at this house. The petulance was gone, replaced by a quiet focus. The hollowness in her eyes had been filled with a sharp intelligence that was finally being put to use. She had lost her fortune, her status, and her fiancé, but in doing so she had found a core of strength she never knew she possessed. That evening, I made a proposal. "Serafina," I began, my heart beating a little faster, "Mr. Davies and I are ready to open our offices next month. I want you to join us." She looked up, shocked. "Join you, as what? A secretary? Your charity case?" The old pride flared for a moment. "No," I said firmly, "as a partner, a junior partner to start, but a partner nonetheless." I saw the disbelief in her eyes, the suspicion that this was some new, elaborate form of pity. I am not offering you charity, Serafina. I am offering you a position because you have earned it. I can read a balance sheet, and Mr. Davies can navigate the market. But you can read a room. You can judge a man's character from a single conversation. That is a skill, and it is every bit as valuable to this enterprise as my ability to calculate compound interest. We need you." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time they were not tears of self-pity or rage. They were tears of shock, of gratitude, and of a fragile dawning hope. She couldn't speak for a long moment. She simply stared at me, at her plain cousin, the girl she had tormented and ignored for 2 decades. "Why?" she finally whispered. "After everything?" "Because," I said, "the truth of it surprising even myself. That person is gone, and I think the person you are becoming is someone I would like to be in business with. And besides, you are my family." She accepted. It was the beginning of our new life. The firm was not called Bishop and Davies, it was Bishop, Beaumont and Davies. When my uncle saw the letterhead for the first time, he wept. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a bewildered, broken pride in the daughter he had so thoroughly misunderstood. The years passed. Our firm did not just succeed, it flourished. We became a quiet powerhouse in the city, known for our shrewd investments in innovation and our uncanny ability to back the right people. I was the head, the strategist. Mr. Davies was the public face, the man who moved through the city's financial circles, and Serafina became our secret weapon. Her charm, once used to conquer ballrooms, was now deployed in boardrooms. She could soothe an anxious inventor, disarm a hostile competitor, and win the trust of wary old money investors, convincing them to take a chance on our bold new world. She found a new kind of respect, one that was earned through intelligence and hard work, not inherited by birth. She never married. She once told me, "I was a product to be sold once. I have no intention of ever being on the market again." Her purpose was the firm, the empire we were building together. Now, all these years later, I sit here in the drawing room of the very townhouse that was once our refuge, and later our headquarters. I bought it long ago. It is comfortable, but not ostentatious. Serafina sits across from me, her hair a startling, elegant white, reading a report on a new company that proposes to transmit messages without wires. She looks up and catches me watching her. "What is it, Flora?" she asks, her voice, once tinkling, now rich and warm. "I was just thinking," I say, a smile touching my lips, "about that wedding dress." She laughs, a genuine deep laugh that fills the room. Ghastly thing, wasn't it? So much lace, I can't imagine what I was thinking. She pauses, her expression growing thoughtful. "Do you know, Flora," she says, her blue eyes, still so vibrant, meeting mine. "Losing everything was the very best thing that ever happened to me. I look out the window at the bustling London street, at the evidence of the world we helped build, and I know she is right. True wealth, you see, isn't what you inherit, it's what you build within yourself and in the world around you. And sometimes the people who see the least in you, who dismiss you and confine you to the margins, are the very ones who give you the most space to grow in secret. Your potential is not defined by the smallness of their vision. It is defined only by the breadth of your own." Thank you for joining me and listening to my story. I hope it has resonated with you in some way. I would be so honored if you would share your own story in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated? How did you prove them wrong? Or more importantly, how did you prove yourself right? Your stories give strength to so many others. If my journey meant something to you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the quiet strength that lies within us all. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, who is feeling invisible or overlooked, please share this video with them. Thank you for being here with me today. Remember, your value is your own, no matter who else sees it. Be well.